So, according to the dump in his diaper delegates, the Canadians are mean and nasty. Well, this old gal is more than happy to resemble that remark.
We get to see the maple trees, maple sugar and the maple leaves. We get the biggest wheat fields growing tall. In Canada, where we see the reversing falls. In Canada, we get to see them all.
G'day, eh?
Things just got a little frosty between Canada and the United States. At a recent summit in Washington, U.S. Ambassador to Canada Pete Hoekstra stunned the room, saying some Americans, including President Trump, view Canada as mean and nasty. Why? Because Canadians are boycotting U.S. goods, travel, and alcohol, all in response to ongoing U.S. tariffs and trade tensions. Some provinces, like British Columbia and Ontario, have already banned U.S. alcohol from government stores. Travel to the U.S. by Canadians dropping for 6 months straight. BC Premier David Eby fired back, saying, "Keep it up, double down. Stand strong for Canada."
Well, after his taunts and threats backfired and Canadians suddenly galvanized behind a new Liberal leader in Mark Carney, our new PM has now put us in the perfect position to forge our own future with a strong and diverse economy as the casino bankrupter goes up against an actual banker.
Trade deals that have been agreed by other jurisdictions, European Union yesterday, Japan before, Indonesia, etc., the United Kingdom, that there are many aspects to these negotiations. We're engaged in them, but the assurance for Canadian business, for Canadians, is we will only sign a deal that's the right deal, that's a good deal for Canada. We're representing Canada, we're standing up for Canada. The United States and Canada can do many good things together. We have done that in the past. We can do more in the future, but on fair terms for our country. As I say, we're standing up for Canada, Canadian interests. Of course, the United States is looking out, the President's looking out for the interests of American workers. There is a landing zone that's possible, but we have to get there, and we'll see what happens.
Carney's One Canadian Economy plan is quickly taking shape as the bloated bully is still hurling his schoolboy insults and demanding our attention. Our vicious citizen-led volunteer boycott of U.S. goods and travel is not letting up either.
Vince's Market got its start in Toronto in 1986 and serves about 30,000 customers weekly.
March was when the real tariff threat was like all the news. We had Canada flags everywhere in the store.
Tremarky says since then, his customers have moved decisively away from U.S. products.
At the height of when we are out of Canada's growing season, we could be upwards of 60%, 70% American produce. Okay? Right now, we're only running at about 30%.
Canadian flags and labels mark domestic goods in aisles, while apps like MapleScan help shoppers identify origin. Canada is America's second largest food export market, worth $28.4 billion in 2024. The boycott has impacted other parts of the store too.
How is that affecting kind of these perceived American products like Coca-Cola or Lay's?
Yeah, Coca-Cola and Lay's are great examples of global brands. They actually bottle Coke bottles in Canada, about an hour and 30 minutes north of here. Frito-Lay uses Canadian potatoes. There would have been no identification of where Frito-Lay products were made. It would have been small and on the back. Once they realized that they were getting a bad rap, they went ahead and they added Made in Canada labels permanently onto the bags.
Why should we risk our dollars going towards an openly hostile administration or risk freedom and rights being abused by border security and ICE? They're already detaining our own citizens, among others.
I'm never going to be the same. You see, it comes and goes. It's like a stall pit.
Edouard Lallemand is still very emotional when he talks about what happened on Sunday evening. Lallemand was out fishing near Venise en Quebec. The water connects to Lake Champlain in the U.S. But Lallemand says he knows for certain he was on the Canadian side.
I'm seeing them. They're coming towards me. And then I know in my heart, I'm in Canada. I said, you can't do nothing to me.
The boat that was approaching, he says, was the U.S. Coast Guard. They asked him to turn off his engine. He complied. They told him he was in U.S. territory.
No, I'm very sorry. I'm in Canada. And I said, you know, I'm polite enough to talk to you guys, but you cannot arrest me. You can't come across the border and pick me up. They did.
L'Allemand says he started his engine and tried to make his way further into Canada, but he says the Coast Guard followed and tried pushing him into the U.S. Eventually, his boat capsized. L'Allemand was in the water and says he was drowning.
You know what they're doing? They're tying to my boat to their boat. They're not even taking care of me. Not at all. I'm the one who told them. The third time I went down, coming out with water in my mouth, spitting it out, I said, throw me a buoy.
He says he was handcuffed on the U.S. Coast Guard boat and eventually turned over to Border Patrol. He was detained and placed in a holding cell without a proper explanation, he says.
I said, are you arresting me? No, sir, you're detained. I said, detained for what? I said, you aggressed me. I didn't do nothing to you guys. I didn't even hit you guys.
Last week, the premiers held a meeting on tariff and trades in Huntsville, Ontario, and in press meetings afterwards, they were all committed to making the best deals possible for Canada and say they're prepared to wait out the U.S.'s August deadline.
Let's begin with what we heard yesterday. The Prime Minister and the Premiers indicating the August 1st deadline for a trade deal may not be met. Tell us more.
Yeah, good morning, Marcia. So the clear line from the Prime Minister yesterday was that he is looking for the best deal for Canada. And it really does seem that no one, not the Prime Minister, frankly, the U.S. administration or premiers, are married to that August 1st deadline. Their sentiment on this side of the border is if we have to agree to whatever is on the table August 1st, that might not be in our best interest. They are willing to kind of wait it out, keep talking, if that means Canada could get a better deal.
Well, I'm wondering, what is your sense of where things stand with August 1st approaching? I mean, there's obviously an unpredictability in the president. There is an uncertainty in the economy.
Well,
I mean, where do you think we are?
Say the least when you're talking about President Trump. Where we are is, I think, a deep breath, some patience would go a long way right now. I totally understand business owners, employees who are feeling so much pressure because of what the president has done. But we also need to, I think, understand that a bad deal for Canada would be worse than some of the other options, like putting up with more uncertainty for a few more months, taking us later into this year.
BC, British Columbia's Premier Eby, said the response to Donald Trump's tariffs appear to be having an impact. If you're a mean and nasty Canadian for standing up for our sovereignty and our economy and our jobs, well, I think most Canadians would be proud to be considered mean and nasty, he said. Green Party's Elizabeth May said that Canada should create a strategic reserve of potash, a group of minerals primarily used in fertilizers. She claims the move would target Trump's key voters, including supporters in the powerful corn and ethanol lobby. She said, we need to bite deep there so that he feels some pain and decides it would be a good idea to start actually reducing tariffs on Canada to get some relief from us. And at a separate summit, the Prime Minister met with Indigenous leaders to discuss their concerns over treaties and environment being affected by the new projects, including pipelines and other infrastructure.
And that's the possibility. Now the job for leadership, myself included, but I'm only one of many. The premiers, the leaders of the rights holders, as I say, the modern treaty leaders, to work with what do we want to do.
What in Mark Carney's mind is a major project that this country needs right now?
Well, so I'm going to answer that in a different way if you don't mind, which is that I don't have a preset notion on a specific project that we must do. But what we did in the legislation is sort of define the elements of, well, what does build a nation? And there's 5 elements, and one of them is, of course, it advances Canada's economic interests. It makes us stronger.
Some of the chiefs were dismayed by the Prime Minister's approach to pushing through those projects hastily without consultation and consent, and others said they were grateful that their concerns were heard.
Where the Wet'suwet'en joins the Skeena River.
Wet'suwet'en Hereditary Chief Na'Moks returned from the nation's capital late Friday night after traveling for more than 20 hours. One of the first things he did was go to the banks of the Skeena River.
And it's to rejuvenate after a pretty hectic week of basically listening to a script being read to us.
Chief Na'Moks was one of many First Nations leaders attending the federal government's Indigenous Summit, a meeting aimed at addressing concerns over the recently passed Bill C-5, which gives Carney's Liberals wide powers to fast-track major infrastructure projects. Chief Na'Moks says he came back feeling frustrated, dismayed, and worried for his land.
At some points, I was hurt by having somewhat faith in the government and then them constantly saying, the Prime Minister himself, this is law, which is insinuating that if we stand up for clean water, clean air, rights, titles, and freedoms, and the very democracy of this country, then we're criminal.
Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, president of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, echoed those concerns.
Prime Minister Carney sat there and said that this is now the law of the land. You have a choice. Get on board or get out of the way. But we're moving ahead.
I think that it was a good first step. I know I was speaking to many chiefs last night, asking them their thoughts. And a lot of them were very, very thankful that the Prime Minister rolled up his sleeves, stayed the full day with First Nations yesterday, heard their concerns, and there's a lot of work to do. So I just, I look forward to the months ahead. And, I just hope that, the Prime Minister had committed to go province by province, territory by territory. So, we're going to hold him to that to make sure that he goes to each region and meets with First Nations in their territories.
What are the big concerns for you?
Look, I think that there's still a diversity of opinions out there. I'm glad that the Prime Minister was there. We have requested that he work with us to close the $350 billion infrastructure gap that exists on First Nations communities at the moment. We don't want to be having these same conversations 30 years from now. Our grandchildren shouldn't have to have these same conversations. And look, our children, all of our children, whether they're on or off reserve, deserve to have proper schools, proper housing, safe communities, infrastructure, roads, and I just think that, access to high-speed internet, things that our kids take for granted off reserve, children on reserve don't have access to those basic necessities that many Canadians take for granted. And so I know that they're not easy conversations to have, but it's so necessary that we have those conversations to come up with a proper plan to close the huge First Nations infrastructure gap in this country. So we had those discussions yesterday.
And are you optimistic about that in the process, that those will be included, those concerns, and changes will come?
We have to come up with a plan together, a joint plan that we're going to stick with, because I know that there was a plan to close it to the year 2030, and I think that we're off track on that. And, we need to get back to the table to close that infrastructure gap. I think that that's one thing that's uniting. Another promising aspect was that the Prime Minister yesterday in his closing remarks said that, he would, he heard it loud and clear from chiefs in the room that there can't be budget cuts to First Nations programs and services come the fall. We know that this country's, that his government's looking to cut, and, they cannot do that to First Nations people when the gaps are so far apart.
Indigenous leaders in British Columbia's north coast are calling on the federal government to hold out against pressure from Alberta and industry to reverse the West Coast oil export ban. On Tuesday, the Coastal First Nations, a group of 9 First Nations along the north and central coast of BC and Haida Gwaii, wrote an open letter to Prime Minister Mark Carney. The group urged the government to uphold Bill C-48, known as the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act. Since 2019, the law has prohibited tankers carrying 12,500 metric tons of crude oil and other oil products from stopping or transferring cargo at any port between the northern tip of Vancouver Island and the Alaska border, which includes Haida Gwaii, the Hecate Strait, or I'm not sure, I pronounce it Hecate, it might be Hecate, and Queen Charlotte Sound. The controversy comes as Carney said in a recent statement that new bitumen pipeline to BC's northern coast is highly, highly likely. His remark aligns with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and federal Conservative MPs' push to lift the tanker ban. Smith has specifically called for faster federal approvals for pipeline projects and an exemption at the port of Prince Rupert. to allow oil exports to Asia. But Marilyn Slett, president of the Coastal First Nations and chief counselor of the Hitsuk Tribal Council, said oil tankers are a non-starter for her community. An oil tanker project is not something we could ever provide consent to, she said. Our communities rely on healthy oceans and ecosystems for our livelihood and culture. Reversing or weakening this legislation would put everything our communities depend on at risk. 2 weeks ago, Ontario signed an historic energy deal with Alberta that covers pipelines, rail lines, and other energy infrastructure. Other industries, such as the softwood lumber industry, are pivoting to keep jobs and do more trade within Canada to combat the recent 20% hike on anti-dumping duties.
While the Trump administration is taking aim at a major Canadian export, the U.S. Commerce Department is hiking anti-dumping duties on Canadian softwood lumber to 20.56%. British Columbia lumber organizations are condemning the sharp increase, calling it unjustified, punitive, and protectionist. For more on this, Andy Riley joins me now. He's the president of Riley Lumber. Can you give me a sense of what that will look like to manage the blow of this in order, as you say, to keep people working?
Well, that's a great question because, you know, we've faced this kind of thing before. So for a company like ours, we're going to have to probably look at selling more into Canada. We're going to have to look at doing more custom work with our mill that's out in the Fraser Valley. We're probably going to have to just be honest with our customers. And believe me, our U.S. customers are, quite frankly, they're our friends. We've dealt with them for 30 years, and they don't like this any more than we do.
Interprovincial trade. Talk to me about how that works into all of this, and is that part of that solution now as we're seeing those barriers coming down?
You know, that doesn't really affect the products that we do too much in terms of value-added products going between British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, Quebec. So that doesn't really affect us. I will say that we had a very productive meeting with Minister LeBlanc and Minister Tim Hodgson last week in Ottawa with our Pan-Canadian Value-Added Group. And they were very supportive of the idea of trying to get together with the Americans and talk about getting a negotiated settlement, because this is getting difficult.
Carney also announced his plans to protect the Canadian steel industry. And in a surprising move, Mexico has quietly joined Canada's Northern Corridor Free Trade Series to avoid the taco tariffs.
The balance in North America has been upset. Mexico and Canada are set to establish the Northern Corridor route, which will bypass US President Donald Trump's 30% tariff on steel and auto parts. Canada and Mexico are preparing to divert $120 billion worth of trade from US customs ports to their own ports. Will this joint escape plan collapse Detroit's assembly lines and force Washington to back down?
We're not, and will never be, a national threat to the U.S. Your man's doing a good enough job of that himself. And there's no good reason to increase Department of Defense funding for the U.S. military to use in a plan to take over or to take land by force from Greenland, Canada, or Panama. No money for invasions.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will attempt to be brief. This amendment basically to prohibit the Department of Defense, the President, from using military force to grab territory from Canada, Panama, or Greenland. We will remember during the hearing, Secretary Hegseth, despite Mr. Turner's noble efforts to try to give him an opportunity to say so, would not deny that they had a plan to use the U.S. military to, by force, take land from any one of those three places. I think that is a very bad idea for a number of reasons. Most importantly, it has been a cornerstone of our foreign policy since the end of World War I to try and put in place a rules-based international order. Now, I understand that is not perfect and certainly hasn't been perfect, but it is an incredibly important principle of international law that really didn't used to exist. Fascinating article in Foreign Affairs just last month outlining the history of it. And prior to World War II, it was kind of accepted that if countries wanted to take land, international law allowed them to do so. Changing that has given us the most peaceful 80 years in the history of human civilization. I know it may not seem like it, but by comparison, it is. If we, the United States of America, who was most responsible for positing that change in international law, just shredded to go after Canada, Greenland, and Panama, we are jeopardizing the very global security system that we put in place and offering justifications to Putin and Xi and others who want to do the same thing.
Try as they might to paint us as being the mean and nasty ones, we are not a security threat to the U.S. In fact, it's the opposite. However, thanks to the Tango Taco never thinking things through, we've increased our spending on strengthening our military. And this week, for the first time ever, the Canadian Navy unveiled its mean new uncrewed Hammersmith maritime system with explosives. No, Donald, Canada didn't actually burn down the White House like you claimed. But we'd be happy to challenge you to a snowball fight. It's not even your supposed August deadline yet, but winter's coming soon, and you'll be frozen out completely. Like, subscribe, share. We love y'all. Check out our other links too.
Hey, yeah, you. Before you click away to watch someone unbox a tactical toothbrush, let's talk about something real. Political Drain isn't just another content mill. We're a digital front in a very real war. Not with bullets, but with ideas, with action, and with solidarity. We pair urgent news with critical education. And we build community around actual resistance, not the hashtag kind. The kind that moves. But here's the thing. None of this is free. It isn't. Behind every video is time, labor, research, and some weird guy asking if we're going to pay the hosting bill. And yeah, some of that money goes to things we can't necessarily say out loud. If you know, you know. Let's just say our special ops aren't Call of Duty LARPers. They're people making real moves to protect, uplift, and organize. You're not just funding a channel. You're funding a resistance network in a world where capital still calls the shots. Unfortunately, in a system built on artificial scarcity, even mutual aid has a price tag. And if we want to grow, if we want to win, we need your help. We need your help. So if you've got even a few bucks to spare, toss it our way. It's not for ads. It's not for merch drops, but for people making moves in the shadows so others can do it in the light. It's just us and you. So fund the mission, fund the fight, fund the future, because nobody's coming to save us. We save each other. That's how this works. Follow us on all these things you see here, and our link tree is in the description. Maybe even get some merch.